bed, his gaze fixed on the small set of keys he'd just uncovered. They glimmered under the dim light of the room, casting tiny reflections that made them look almost ordinary. But there was nothing ordinary about this. He'd found them tucked away in a pocket of Sophia's bag, buried beneath receipts, makeup, and the fragments of her day-to-day life. They were attached to a small silver tag with an address he didn't recognize. For weeks, Sophia had returned home late, armed with the same vague excuses about work, friends, or errands. Each time, her smile seemed dimmer, her laugh more forced. When he'd first asked about her new routine, she'd brushed off his concerns, wrapping herself in a breezy confidence that left no room for argument. But Daniel had watched silently as distance formed a chasm between them, widening each time she walked through the door smelling of something faintly unfamiliar. Now, the keys sat heavily in his palm, a quiet accusation he could neither ignore nor explain. He knew he could confront her tonight, demand answers, ask where this address led. But a part of him, a cautious, painful part, realized he needed to see for himself. Taking a shaky breath, Daniel slipped the keys into his own pocket, resolving that by tomorrow he would understand the secret she kept and the life she had chosen to build without him. The night air felt thick as Daniel made his way to the address. He walked slowly, rehearsing questions and scenarios in his mind, hoping that with each step he'd find an innocent explanation for what he was about to uncover. Yet deep down he sensed that whatever lay at the end of his journey was anything but innocent. The building stood quietly on the corner of a narrow, tree-lined street. It was one of those older, charming buildings, cozy, with ivy creeping up the stone walls and warmly lit windows that seemed to welcome its residents home. Daniel took in the surroundings, absorbing the unlikely beauty of the place. Was this where Sophia disappeared to when she wasn't at home? Did she sit in one of these apartments, laugh, and share secrets with someone he didn't know? With a heavy heart, he unlocked the main door and stepped into a small, warmly lit lobby. A flight of creaking stairs led him up to the third floor. Room 306, the number etched into the address tag, burned in his mind as he approached it, hand trembling. For a long moment he simply stood there, his heart pounding. He wanted nothing more than to turn around and forget all of this, but the pull of curiosity, the need to know, kept his feet planted. Finally, he pushed the key into the lock. The door gave way, revealing a small, intimate space. Warm lighting from shaded lamps cast a soft glow across the room, illuminating the delicate touches that could only belong to Sophia. It was all there, her favorite novel stacked on a small table, a lavender-scented candle burning faintly on the windowsill, her shoes neatly lined by the door. This wasn't a cold, impersonal room rented for brief moments of escape. It was a second life, a retreat designed with her comfort in mind. He stepped further in, his fingers grazing the back of a soft velvet couch as he took in the scattered details. A framed photo on the bookshelf caught his attention, a picture of Sophia smiling brightly, wearing a dress he'd never seen. And then he saw it, the shadow of a man, half-cropped from the frame but unmistakable, his arm around her shoulders, his head turned toward her in a way that spoke of quiet intimacy. Daniel's breath hitched, and a painful realization settled over him like a shroud. There was someone else here, someone who knew her in ways he had once assumed were his own. He felt sick. Moving through the apartment, he noted the subtle signs that confirmed his worst fears. A leather jacket tossed casually over a chair, a book on the nightstand with a bookmark marking the halfway point. In the closet, he saw a pair of men's shoes worn and scuffed next to her collection of heels. It was real. The evidence was all around him, quietly damning. He sank into a chair by the window, numb and disoriented, feeling like he was floating above the remnants of a life he could no longer recognize. He clenched his fists, his mind racing with fragmented thoughts, questions without answers. How long had she been seeing this man? How had he not seen it sooner? But even as anger and hurt rose within him, Daniel found himself stuck there, unable to leave. Paralyzed by a heartbreak so profound it left him staring vacantly at the world outside. Daniel sat frozen in the chair, his gaze falling blankly on the world outside the window, his mind struggling to reconcile the familiar touches with this stranger space. The apartment felt as if it were mocking him, each small detail around him carrying the weight of betrayal. He reached out instinctively, picking up a ceramic mug on the coffee table, one with a chip on the side, worn from daily use. It wasn't just a mug, it was a part of her, an everyday item he recognized from their own home. Yet here it was, too comfortable, too lived in, to belong to anyone else. A low hum buzzed in his ears as anger began to dissolve the numbness. This wasn't just an affair, it was a life she had built, painstakingly and deliberately, without him. He couldn't understand how she could deceive him so deeply, hide something so vast. His heart pounded as he walked toward the bedroom, his hands trembling as he opened the closet door wider. The sight within was another blow. He saw the familiar blush of her silk blouses, her sweaters folded neatly, interspersed with men's shirts and jackets. It was like an invasion, the way her things mingled with another man's. There, hanging from the closet door handle, was her scarf. He'd seen her wear it on those late nights when she claimed to be working late. "I'll be back soon," she would say, kissing him goodbye. And he'd believed her, had trusted the softness in her eyes, the warmth of her smile. But now that scarf was nothing but a symbol of every quiet deception, every unspoken truth. Daniel's eyes fell on a small dresser drawer slightly ajar, a slip of pale blue silk caught in the edge. It was intimate, revealing, as if exposing something far deeper than physical infidelity. He pulled it open and found her jewelry, a necklace he had bought her on their first anniversary, a pair of earrings she wore only on special occasions, glistening coldly in the soft light. It stung, realizing these pieces he'd once thought special had become part of a stranger's life, a backdrop to moments he could only imagine with dread. His breath quickened as he moved to the bookshelf, scanning the collection. She had a few of her favorite novels here, books they'd discussed late into the night, each marked with notes in the margins, thoughts and reflections they had shared. And yet, on the shelf below, he saw a different set of books, novels he didn't recognize with bookmarks wedged in the pages. They were books she had never shared with him, stories that were not part of their life together. How many times had she come here, escaping into these other worlds, seeking comfort in these pages with another person beside her? He picked up one of the books, his fingers tracing the spine. Inside, he found an inscription in her handwriting, the words small but unmistakable, "For the moments that are ours alone." The ink was fresh, the page unwrinkled. His heart clenched, a wave of pain twisting in his chest. She had created a separate world, a private sanctuary, one he had never been meant to find. He sank back into the chair, his hand still clutching the book, his mind a whirlwind of emotions, betrayal, humiliation, loss. It was as though she had stripped away every illusion he'd had about their marriage, laid bare all the cracks he had refused to see. The anger inside him surged, hot and powerful, but it was swiftly tempered by the overwhelming sadness that crept in, deeper and colder than anything he had ever felt. Daniel leaned his head back, closing his eyes, willing himself to hold it together. He wasn't ready to confront her, not yet. This was still too raw, too agonizing. But he knew one thing: when he finally did face her, he wouldn't let her walk away untouched. The silence in the apartment weighed heavily on Daniel, thick and suffocating, pressing down with each breath he took. He hadn't moved from the chair in what felt like hours. His mind kept drifting through moments with Sophia, holidays, shared dreams, quiet mornings spent in the warmth of their bed. It all seemed distant now, as if they belonged to another life, a life that felt unreal compared to the piercing reality of the room around him. He glanced around, his gaze landing on the small details he'd missed before. There was a blanket folded neatly at the foot of the couch, another familiar item, a soft throw he remembered her curling up in on cold nights. He touched it, his fingers brushing against the fabric. He could almost picture her sitting here, wrapped in its warmth, waiting for someone who wasn't him. The apartment was clean, well cared for. There were no stray dishes or clutter, everything had its place. His anger smoldered, simmering in his veins as he pieced together the depth of her betrayal. He wondered how long she had carefully maintained this dual life. How many times had she lied to his face, telling him she'd be home soon while secretly disappearing into this other world? A faint noise from outside the door startled him. He froze, his pulse quickening. For a brief, panicked moment, he thought she might walk through that door, unsuspecting, carrying bags of groceries or speaking softly into her phone. He imagined the look of shock, the flood of excuses, the stammered apologies she would offer when she saw him there, sitting in the life she'd kept hidden. But as the seconds passed, the noise faded, and silence resumed its reign. Slowly, he stood up, feeling a determination take hold within him. His hurt still roared beneath the surface, but it was now joined by a grim resolve. He couldn't leave things like this, couldn't let her slide back into her comfortable lies. He deserved answers. He deserved to look into her eyes and see her understand the depth of what she'd done to him. Daniel pulled out his phone, his fingers hovering over her contact. He hesitated, realizing how hollow and unsatisfying a phone confrontation would be. No, he needed her to see him in person, to look into his eyes and witness his devastation. Closing the phone, he felt an unexpected calm settle over him. He would go home and wait for her there just as he'd done so many times before. Only this time there would be no forgiveness waiting for her. Before he left, he took one last look around the apartment, his gaze lingering on the details he'd initially ignored. He noticed a pair of mugs in the sink, one still half full with cold coffee, lipstick smudging the rim. His stomach twisted, a bitter wave of anger and disgust rising up in him. This had been their ritual coffee in the mornings, sharing quiet conversations. But now even the simplest gestures had been twisted and given to someone else. Steeling himself, he walked to the door, his footsteps echoing in the emptiness behind him. He locked the door with a final click, as if sealing off this other life she had created, a life that, from this moment on, he would not let go unnoticed. He made his way home in silence, each step carrying the weight of 1,000 thoughts, none of them comforting. As he opened the door to their shared home, a strange sense of clarity settled over him. Tonight she would return to him, expecting the safety of her routine, the usual conversations over a late dinner or a glass of wine. And tonight, he would be ready, stripped of the trust he'd once held, ready to face her with the truth she'd buried in that apartment. He took a seat in the living room, letting the quiet settle around him like a shield. Whatever story she'd prepared for tonight, whatever excuses she'd crafted, he would meet them head on. He would watch her every reaction, her every word, and ensure that for the first time she faced the consequences of the life she had chosen to lead without him. Daniel didn't have to wait long. The familiar sound of Sophia's key in the lock snapped him to full attention. She stepped into the entryway, her face lighting up with a practiced smile. It faded when she saw him sitting there in the dim light, his expression unreadable. She paused, surprise flickering across her features as she slipped off her coat, her movements suddenly hesitant. "You're home early," she said, her voice carrying a slight tremor that she quickly masked with a forced casualness. She looked around the room, as if sensing the tension hovering between them. Daniel studied her, noting every small sign of nervousness, the slight shift of her weight, the brief glance to the side, as though she could avoid whatever she saw in his eyes. For a moment he was struck by how well he knew her, how he could read her with just one look. Yet he had missed so much. "Where were you tonight?" he asked, his voice low, steady. She hesitated, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. "I told you I had work. And then I was meeting Emma for a quick drink. I didn't want to wake you when I got in." Daniel let the silence linger, waiting for her to fill it, watching her shift uncomfortably under his gaze. He could see her calculating her next words, perhaps even searching his face for some indication of how much he knew. But he remained impassive, giving her nothing. "You have to understand," she started, taking a small step forward. "Work has been stressful lately, and sometimes I just need a little space." Daniel nodded, taking in her words as if they held weight, as if they hadn't crumbled to dust in the dim light of that hidden apartment. "I found something interesting today, actually," he said, reaching into his pocket and pulling out the set of keys he'd taken from her bag. He held them up, watching her expression shift, the color draining from her face as her eyes fixed on the keys. There was no mistaking the recognition in her gaze, the dawning fear. "Daniel, I can explain." "Go ahead, Sophia," he interrupted, his tone harsh, slicing through the lies he could feel coming. "Explain how you've been using these. Tell me what you've been doing all those late nights. Tell me why I found an apartment that looks like you've been living a whole other life." She opened her mouth, but no words came. Her hand went to her throat, fingers trembling slightly as she struggled for something, anything that could save her. "It's not what you think," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I was going to tell you, I just didn't know how." "How long?" Daniel's voice was low, calm, but beneath the surface, the anger and hurt simmered dangerously. "How long have you been lying to me?" Sophia looked down, her eyes filling with tears. It wasn't supposed to be like this. It just happened, Daniel. I didn't mean for it to get so complicated. But I wasn't happy. I needed something else, and I didn't know how to tell you." The admission hung in the air, cold and brutal. For a moment, Daniel felt as though he couldn't breathe. "You needed something else," he echoed, the words tasting bitter. "So you built another life and shut me out of it. You made a choice every day to keep me in the dark, to lie, to betray the life we shared." She looked up at him, desperation in her eyes. "I didn't want to hurt you. I know it was wrong, but I felt trapped. I felt like I couldn't be myself with you anymore." Daniel's jaw tightened. He wanted to scream, to throw something to erase the words she'd just said. But instead, he simply stared at her, the realization sinking in that nothing she said could undo what he'd seen, what he now knew. "So what now, Sophia?" he asked, finally, his voice hollow. "What am I supposed to do with all of this? With you?" She took a step forward, reaching for his hand, but he pulled back. "I don't know," she whispered, barely able to meet his gaze. "I don't know what to say to make this right." Daniel shook his head, feeling the last remnants of hope slipping away. He looked at her, really looked at her, as if seeing her for the first time, and as the image of the life they'd built together crumbled around him, he realized it was already over. The silence between them felt endless, punctuated only by the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Sophia looked at him with eyes full of fear and regret, as if willing him to forgive her, to take her back into the life she had broken apart. But Daniel knew there was no return from this. The damage went too deep, the trust was shattered beyond repair. Finally, he broke the silence, his voice rough, weary. "Was it worth it?" he asked, the words carrying the weight of his heartbreak. "This second life you built without me, was it everything you hoped for?" She flinched, her face twisting in pain. "Daniel, please don't. I didn't mean for it to be like this. I was lost. I thought I needed something different, but I never wanted to lose you." He let out a bitter laugh, devoid of humor. "Lose me? You lost me the moment you chose to walk into that other apartment, Sophia. You lost me every time you came home to me after spending nights in that place. You didn't just lose me, you gave me away." Her hands clasped together as she fought to keep her composure, her face pale. I know I don't deserve anything from you. I know I messed everything up." She took a shaky breath, a tear slipping down her cheek. "But please, Daniel, can't we try to fix this?" Daniel's gaze hardened, his eyes searching hers for some hint of sincerity, some sign of the woman he'd once loved. But all he saw was desperation, the kind that clung to her words only because her secret was finally out, her lies unraveled. There was no real remorse for the choices she had made, only fear of what those choices would now cost her. "Fix this?" he echoed, incredulous. "How do you suggest we fix something that's already destroyed? You think I can just pretend that I didn't see that apartment, that I don't know about the other man or the nights you lied to my face?" She was silent, her tears falling freely now, but her silence was answer enough. They both knew there was nothing she could say, no magic words that could erase the betrayal that lay between them. Daniel looked around the living room, taking in the remnants of their life together, the photos, the mementos of shared moments, the small touches she'd once brought into their home. All of it felt like a cruel joke now, a facade that had crumbled to reveal the empty truth beneath. His voice softened, growing steadier, as he finally accepted what he had known deep down since the moment he'd stepped into that apartment. "It's over, Sophia," he said quietly, his tone calm, resolute. "I can't be with someone who would do this. I can't live with the memory of what you've done." Her face crumpled as she reached out, her hand trembling. "Please don't say that. I'll do anything. Please don't leave me." He stepped back, shaking his head, his voice barely above a whisper. "You already left me, Sophia. You left me every time you walked into that other life. I'm just catching up." A final silence fell over them as her tears turned to quiet sobs, her shoulders shaking with the force of her grief. But Daniel felt nothing but an emptiness that stretched far beyond any words. There was no relief, no satisfaction, just a hollow ache where love had once been. With one last look at her, a look filled with everything he would never say, he turned toward the door, each step pulling him further from the life they had once shared. And as he walked out, leaving her to the reality she had created, he felt the first stirrings of freedom, even as the pain lingered. He didn't look back, knowing that some things once broken could never truly be mended. The days after Daniel walked away from Sophia unfolded in quiet shades of gray. Everything felt like an echo, as if his life had been stripped of its color and sound. He woke each morning to silence, no longer lulled by her presence, by the comforting routines they'd once shared. Yet strangely, this new emptiness was a relief, a vast, quiet space where he could begin to rebuild alone. He found himself haunted by memories, especially during the stillness of early morning or late at night when he was most vulnerable. He would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment he had missed, every sign of her betrayal he'd failed to see. He tried to understand where things had gone wrong, wondering if there was something he could have done to prevent it. But each question circled back to the same painful answer: she had chosen this path, and he had been powerless to stop her. A few weeks after that night, Daniel packed away the remnants of their life together. He boxed up the photos, the little mementos they'd collected over the years, the pressed flower from their honeymoon, the postcards from their travels, the silly magnets they'd bought as joke. Each item felt heavy with the weight of a shared past, but they no longer belonged in his home. These pieces of their history, once cherished, now felt foreign and empty, stripped of their meaning. As he cleared the shelves, he stumbled across one last photograph of them together. It was a candid shot from a friend's wedding, capturing them mid-laugh, eyes sparkling with a happiness that now seemed impossible to reclaim. For a moment he felt a pang of sorrow, a faint urge to hold on to the photo, as if clinging to some part of what they had once been. But he knew better. Memories, even beautiful ones, were just ghosts. They had no power to bring back the life he'd lost. With a heavy sigh, he placed the photograph face down in the box, sealing it shut along with the life they'd once built. He left the boxes by the door for her to pick up, knowing she would come when he wasn't there. He wanted no final goodbyes, no last-minute pleas. Their story had ended, and he was determined to move forward without her shadow darkening his path. In the weeks that followed, Daniel poured himself into his work, his exercise routine, anything that allowed him to focus his mind and escape the gnawing ache of loss. But healing wasn't linear. It came in fits and starts, with moments of quiet resilience punctuated by sudden waves of pain. Every so often he would think of Sophia, where she was, whether she'd returned to that apartment, and the man she'd chosen. The questions lingered in the back of his mind, but he resisted the urge to know. Her choices were her own, and they no longer held sway over him. Months passed, and slowly Daniel began to rebuild his sense of self, piecing together fragments of a new life. He reconnected with old friends, took up new hobbies, and allowed himself moments of joy, however small. Each day felt a little lighter than the last. He was learning to live without the constant ache, rediscovering who he was apart from the man he'd been with her. One afternoon he found himself at a local art gallery, an invitation from a friend who knew he needed a distraction. As he wandered through the exhibits, he felt a sense of calm settle over him, a quiet peace that surprised him. He had been afraid that happiness was something he would never find again. Yet here he was, feeling content, whole even. At one exhibit, a painting caught his eye. It was a simple landscape, a lone tree standing against a backdrop of rolling hills, bathed in the warm light of dawn. The painting was vibrant, full of life, and he felt drawn to it in a way he couldn't quite explain. The lone tree seemed to represent resilience, a quiet strength that resonated with him. For the first time since he had discovered her betrayal, Daniel felt a stirring of hope. The pain had not entirely left him, but it had softened, becoming a part of him rather than something that controlled him. He could see a future now, one where he was no longer defined by what had happened to him, but by what he would choose to become. As he stood there, someone approached him, a woman with a warm, open smile who commented on the beauty of the painting. They spoke for a few minutes, an easy, casual conversation that felt refreshingly free of expectation or weight. She introduced herself as Emily, and he found himself smiling genuinely, for the first time in what felt like ages. They exchanged numbers before parting ways, and as he walked out of the gallery, he felt a lightness he hadn't known in a long time. Over time, Emily and Daniel began to see each other more, sharing quiet evenings and long conversations, slowly building a connection that was simple and true. There was no pretense, no hidden life, only the honest moments of two people who understood the value of trust and vulnerability. In this new relationship, Daniel found a gentler happiness, one that was born not from grand gestures but from quiet understanding. With Emily, he learned that love, when built on openness and mutual respect, could be a healing force, one that allowed him to finally let go of the pain he had carried for so long. The shadows of his past would always remain, but they no longer haunted him. Sophia had become a distant memory, a chapter in his life that he had closed. Now he stood on the cusp of something new, feeling stronger and more certain of himself. For the first time, he was ready to embrace the future, no longer tethered to the betrayals of the past, but free to write a new story.